Anybody know what this is? Yes? Okay, so that's 3 or 4 people. This is a Fitbit, and the reason I put it up here next to the Euro is to give you an idea of what size it is. The Fitbit is a good example of one of those devices that we're all talking about. And if you've ever seen anybody wearing one, this is what it looks like. Fitbit was in the news in 2011 because they had a privacy policy issue, let's say. So if you got a Fitbit before 2011 and you were creating a public profile, you were tracking your data publicly. So you had things like your heart rate, your hours of sleep, and a lot of users were also entering their sexual activity because you can burn calories that way, right? So if you enter your diet and exercise into this thing and you want to have an accurate count, you have to enter all of your steps, and it tracks all kinds of neat things. But the problem was that Fitbit, by default, had a public setting on the user data. So in theory, this meant that if I owned a Fitbit and I was entering my data, anybody could see it, including my sexual activity and all the food that I ate. And some people found this a little upsetting, shall we say. So Fitbit had a lot of press coverage as a result of this. And they decided to change their company policy, and now it's private by default, which is I think a phrase you'll hear a lot of as you look at privacy in the industry of technology, and specifically devices. The reason I find it interesting, though, is because it's just one example of the many ways that we're quantifying ourselves. And if you look at this chart in particular, there's a whole bunch of different kinds of ways we experience that quantification. And the Fitbit is just one of them. At the bottom, you can see some examples of other types of devices that we use that are ways in which we track information about ourselves. So smart meters are another good example. And on the whole, you know, a smart meter doesn't really seem all that interesting from a privacy perspective. But what we've found is that a smart meter actually does tell you a lot about an individual living in a house and their patterns of usage. So some of the early studies on smart meters will tell you things like whether you're a single mother or not, which is kind of interesting, right? Like, how do you derive that from electricity usage? Well, it turns out that single mothers have a habit in terms of when they do laundry. And you can track spikes in electricity usage and water usage in a household and begin to make inferences from that data. Now, what's interesting to me is that inference pattern, and that's what happens when you start wiring these devices together and you get that cloud bubble that represents the internet in the middle of this. And that device data is really where things start to hit the road. You can pull together your Fitbit activity with your smart meter data activity, with your network usage activity, and of course now I think it's Frigidaire that also will put little wired devices in your refrigerator so they can send you a text message to let you know when you're out of milk, or perhaps when you've opened the fridge door too many times today. And those analytics take place at the device level, but once you wire them and put them together, what you really end up having is essentially a really interesting kind of profile of users. And it's way beyond the typical things we think of as private, like my name and address and phone number are just the tip of the iceberg. You know, I can get that anywhere. And that's really not the most interesting thing about me. What's really interesting is how many of these devices are now out there. And for our perspective today, I'll ask you to just think about these two colors right here. This yellow represents consumer and entertainment devices, and the sort of medium-colored blue here, and apologies to anybody who's colorblind, is the communications devices. And this is the proliferation of them in billions. Billions. It's not just about cell phones anymore. A friend of mine has wired Bluetooth hearing aids. Now, he wants them because he looks at this activity as being too revealing about himself. It tells people he has hearing aids when he walks into a room and adjusts them. He likes the idea of having a little wired device in his pocket that he can use to adjust the volume on his hearing aids. The interesting thing is it's networked. Now, why you would need hearing aids that are connected to the internet is beyond me. But somewhere out there, somebody identified this need, and somebody is tracking that data. It's the money, of course, that's the driver. And as the speaker before me talked about capitalism, I was thinking, yeah, it's good, but it's not all good. And there are some unintended consequences. And when you're talking about in the range of $2 billion in an industry, and that's just for the next couple of years, it'll proliferate as the devices do. What we're really talking about, essentially, is this conflict that exists between people and money. And when Deborah first talked to me about coming to speak to you, I think the topic of privacy was just part of what I wanted to talk about. Because privacy really represents a much bigger conflict, and that is one of economy and privacy, and how we're monetizing ourselves through the use of these devices. Because we are, in fact, the product. If you use Gmail or Hotmail or any other type of free technology service, you are, in fact, the product. It's not free. And that's where privacy gets even more interesting. And so what we've seen since, oh goodness, Roman law, I think, was the first, is this need to define privacy. What does it mean? What does it mean for us? What does it mean in terms of how we look at things? And people, I think, have visceral reactions to privacy, and they get it a lot better. Public space and personal space is a good example of that. And if you get really, really close to someone, they tend to smile. Or if they're not sitting down, they do one of these. Now, as a Canadian, this is very, very interesting to me because my notion of personal space is very different from anyone else. And I've noticed that since I moved to the United States, this is a constant challenge for me. I think because there's a hell of a lot more people here, you have a different comfort zone for personal space. And I spend a lot of my time in meetings or in conference rooms trying to find space where there's a chair next to me that's empty or standing at least this far away from someone. That's my comfort zone. To me, that's privacy. But privacy is so very much more than that. It's not just about the physicality of the interaction that we have. It's about those devices, those damn devices that track everything we do, and then correlate it and create this new information economy. When you talk about privacy in that sense, all sorts of other words come up. I love these word clouds because they take the effort out of having to define everything. But essentially, these are all the different kinds of notions that come up when you talk about privacy. There's a lot of familiar words in there. One of the interesting ones, I think, is this notion of control. That pops up a lot, especially in the United States when you talk about privacy. In other countries, they tend to talk more about philosophy, they talk about accountability, and by no means is privacy exceptional when it comes to being cultural specific, you know? And everybody brings their own notion to privacy, their own experience to privacy. If you've ever ridden on public transit, you have a visceral reaction to privacy. From a definition perspective, when it comes to these devices, the law takes a much more discrete stance. Privacy is defined from an informational point of view. Privacy is about my data, the rights that I have associated with that data. But where does that come from? That data is derived from my physicality. My heart rate is privacy. My weight is privacy. My bank statements are privacy. But the other piece is all my stuff. You know, my car, my remote control, my smart meter at home. It's all privacy. And what we're seeing with these devices is all of these things intertwined. All of these things come together to represent our information. And they feed each other. So what you see in privacy research now is this fascinating move towards identification and de-identification. And researchers have begun to look at, if I'm surfing on the web, is my experience different from yours? And the answer we're coming up with is absolutely. I get shown different kinds of ads based on the assumptions of the data that it represents me. I get shown different kinds of information. I get shown different links. It's not all the same. It is not effectively the democratic device that we think it is. It's actually being mediated for us. And it's being mediated based on the information that's derived from those devices. So what can you do with that information? You can do a lot. You can collect it, you can create it, you can use it, you can access it, you can disclose it, you can dispose of it, you can back it up. and you can archive it. And on the internet, nothing ever gets deleted. Dispose is here because it's one of those things you can do with information, but on the internet and in a networked environment, it's almost a theoretical action. Once it's out there, it's out there. And we've all heard or had an email sent to us or sent one that we know we weren't supposed to get. Recently, this actually happened at my office. Somebody very high up in a company sent an email that had a reply all feature to it. Now, luckily enough for them, it wasn't that interesting, but what was really interesting about it was that it happened at all. I work at a software company, so if anybody should know better, it's us. But it happens. You know, it happens because we have these interactions with these devices and they become normal. And they've just become part of us. So where do people sit in the privacy sphere? Well, a couple of different researchers have looked at this question. And they essentially have determined that people in privacy sit in one of three camps. They're either completely unconcerned. Like, these are people who would give away a sample of their DNA for a free Big Mac. Okay? Like, they don't care, doesn't matter, it's all out there, it doesn't matter, whatever happens, happens. You've got some fundamentalists, you know, and I think until quite recently, these were the people who were thought of as sort of the tinfoil hat wearing, off the grid lifestyle kind of folks. And then you've got pragmatists who tend to weigh privacy as a decision, but maybe they don't know that's what they're doing. Maybe they don't call it privacy. Maybe they look at it and say, do I trust you with my data? Okay, yeah, you can have some of it. Or these are people who, for example, like me, when asked if I want a value card at this store or a loyalty card at this store, will say, well, it depends. Like, what does that get me? And what do you want from me in return? I'm the kind of person you don't want to stand behind in line at a store. And I also take it upon myself to educate everyone else around me about it at the same time. So I definitely don't stand behind me. So these attitudes, they shift on a regular basis. And in the UK, there was a very recent study done on this that shows that actually the fundamentalist camp, the previously mentioned tinfoil hat wearing folks, are increasing. And they're increasing fairly substantially. Now, those similar studies have been done in the US, and they very much vary by segment. If you're young, you fall in one group, and if you're older, you fall in another. If you work in some industries, you fall in one group. If you work in other industries, you fall in another. So it becomes almost telling which one of these camps you find yourself in. I think probably as we watch the pragmatist segment grow, we'll see the definition of fundamentalist start to narrow. But it'll be interesting to watch those studies. And a lot of it has to do with this fellow. I'm assuming everybody knows who he is. Okay, safe. When Deborah asked me to talk about privacy and said, you know, she wanted sort of a history of privacy, but also she wanted me to talk about Snowden, I thought, how do you fit that into 20 minutes? So the best thing I could come up with was to show you his picture. And the question I'm going to ask you is very simple. And this is one that privacy professionals have begun to refer to as the question in our field, this being the summer of Snowden. Traitor or whistleblower? What side do you come down on? Because whistleblower has a very specific connotation attached to it, and very, very specific legal protections attached to it. And so whether you fall on one side or the other pretty much tells me how you feel about privacy, but also how you feel about democracy and devices and the collection of information and trust in government and a bunch of other things as well. And it's a really good question and probably a decent icebreaker at a dinner party. Or maybe just the folks I hang out with. But it's an interesting one. And I'm not going to poll, I'm not going to ask, I'm not going to invade your privacy. But it really is the key question for privacy. Where do you stand, whistleblower or traitor? And I think what that comes down to, again, to go back to this information life cycle, is these two key things that happen with our data: disclosure and use. Legitimate disclosure or illegitimate disclosure, appropriate use or misuse. And depending on where you stand, what governments and private sector companies do with your data can be appropriate or inappropriate. And those have nothing whatsoever to do with what the legal protections are. They're that visceral gut reaction to somebody getting closer and closer and closer to you, and you deciding whether you're comfortable or not. And I'm not so sure that we capture that adequately in law. And really what that conflict is about is these laws and this basis for democracy that we have goes back much, much, much further and has a much richer history and was evolved based on a very different society than the one we live in now. And as that technology advances and ramps up and ramps up and ramps up and gets more and more interesting and more networked, and there's more and more data available, we'll see more and more of that conflict. And the problem is, the answer, I don't think, is more laws. And perhaps that's just because I'm not a lawyer. And maybe they know something I don't. But I don't think that the answer is to regulate the hell out of it. Because we can't even begin to imagine how much information there is and what it says about us and what can be done with it. We're just at the beginning of that. And we haven't yet seen how far it will go and what inferences can be made and who will ultimately use it for what purpose. And so the regulation as it currently exists in a lot of countries is based on data typology. If I have your name, address, and phone number, I can do X, Y, and Z with that. So are we just going to legislate every possible type of data? Are we going to classify all of our data? Are we going to try and come up with laws that speak to every potential use or disclosure? I don't think those things are possible, and I don't think they're ideal either, because in some cases, you can see where that begins to stifle innovation. So what's the real relationship we're looking at? The real relationship is between those who govern us and how we are being governed. What is the nature of the information that is available about us, and who do we want to have it? The notion of a democracy is something that each of the speakers before me have brought up and talked about. And I think in privacy, you really see where the conflict arises, because the ability of those governing us to access data about us, to make inferences about us, to watch us, without the tinfoil hat notion, just to watch, suggests that we are entering a phase of human evolution, at least where it comes to democratic societies, where the nature of power is shifting. If you have access to this information, you have power, whether you do something with it or not. You have power by virtue of access. So the centers of power have shifted to the folks who have computational ability, computational power, computational skill. And that's very different. And I would argue that's the first time in history that's happened. So where does that leave us? Well, I'll give you 30 seconds to read this slide. And 30 seconds to read the next. And the last. And there's one more paragraph of this poem. So when you behold bright fishes of gold in globes of immaculate purity, just think how they'd be more contented and free if you gave them a little obscurity. And you who make laws, get busy because you can brighten the lives of untold fish. If it's sadness you note and a measure to promote the private life of a goldfish. Thank you.